Everyone knows the name Onassis, the yachts, the power, the legendary Christina O, where Winston Churchill smoked cigars and Frank Sinatra sang at private parties. The private island of Scorpios, where Jackie Kennedy became Jackie Onassis beneath a canopy of olive trees. The Fifth Avenue apartment overlooking Central Park, where America's most famous widow tried to disappear into a life of quiet elegance. But there is one Onassis property the world has never seen. A mansion so deliberately hidden, so carefully erased from family records, that even historians who've spent decades studying the dynasty barely know it exists. It sits on a remote stretch of Aegean coastline, half swallowed by salt and time. No tours, no plaques, no mention in the glossy coffee table books about old money and Mediterranean power. Just a decaying fortress of stone, empty windows, and memories no one wanted to keep. Locals avoid it. They call it the morning house. Some say the villa that doesn't forget. Fishermen claim they've seen lights flickering in the upper windows at night, though the electricity was cut decades ago. And those who've dared to venture inside describe something unsettling, not supernatural, but human. The feeling that this house was never meant to be a home, that it was built for something else entirely. A vault, a hiding place, a monument to the things the Onassis family couldn't face. Because behind every empire, behind every yacht, every gala, every headline about wealth and glamour, there are secrets too heavy to carry and tragedies too painful to speak aloud. And this mansion, this forgotten palace on the edge of the sea, it holds them all. The story begins not with luxury, but with loss. In 1922, when the city of Smyrna burned and the Onassis family fled with whatever they could carry, they arrived on a desolate stretch of Greek coastline as refugees. Socrates Onassis, Aristotle's father, was a wealthy tobacco merchant who had lost nearly everything in the chaos. His family, traumatized and displaced, found temporary shelter in a weathered villa owned by an old ally. The house was modest, storm-battered, surrounded by cypress trees that creaked in the wind like something mourning. But it was safe. And for a family that had just escaped death, safety was worth more than gold. Aristotle was 17 years old. He watched his father, once proud, once powerful, reduced to a man staring at the sea as if searching for answers the water would never give. And he made a promise. One day this place will be ours, not borrowed, not temporary, ours, and no one will ever take anything from us again. It took him decades to keep that promise. But when he did, he didn't just restore the villa. He transformed it into something else. A fortress built not to welcome the world, but to keep it out. By the 1950s, Aristotle Onassis had become one of the most powerful men on earth. His oil tankers dominated global shipping. His influence reached presidents and prime ministers. His wealth was measured not in millions, but in empires. And quietly, without fanfare or press releases, he began pouring money into the forgotten villa where his family had once hidden. Workers arrived at odd hours. Construction happened behind concealed scaffolding. The house expanded upward and outward. New wings, reinforced walls, underground storage built like the hull of a ship. But this wasn't like his other properties. Not the glittering apartments in Paris or New York. Not the legendary yacht where movie stars danced beneath chandeliers. Not the private island where he would later marry Jackie Kennedy. This house was different because this house was built for grief. Staff who worked there during construction spoke in whispers about strange demands. A nursery kept pristine long after the children were grown. A windowless corridor they were told to call the quiet hallway. A room on the second floor that Aristotle ordered sealed. No explanation, just locked and never mentioned again. One architect claimed he was asked to design a wing only to have it removed from the blueprints before construction was complete. When he asked why, Ari simply said, "Some rooms are better left unbuilt." The mansion became a place Aristotle visited when he needed to disappear, when the weight of his empire became too much, when the public persona, the charming titan, the man who conquered shipping and seduced opera divas, needed to crack just long enough to breathe. He would arrive without warning, stay for days, speak to no one. Servants described him pacing the halls at night, sometimes stopping in front of doors no one else was allowed to open, sometimes standing at the window overlooking the sea, motionless for hours, as if listening to something only he could hear. And then, one day in 1973, everything changed. Alexander Onassis, Aristotle's only son, the heir to the empire, the young man the mansion was allegedly meant for, died in a plane crash under circumstances so strange that conspiracy theories still circulate half a century later. The official report called it pilot error. Others whispered about sabotage, mechanical failure, a doomed flight that should never have taken off. But the cause didn't matter to Aristotle. All that mattered was that his son was gone. And when the news reached him, he didn't go to the yacht, didn't retreat to the island, didn't surround himself with advisors or family or the trappings of power. He went to the mansion. He arrived within hours, alone, and locked himself inside. For days, no one saw him. Staff left food at the door and found it untouched. They heard sounds, shouting, sobbing, objects being thrown, but no one dared enter. When he finally emerged, he looked like a different man. Older, hollowed out, as if something vital had been carved from him and left to rot in one of those sealed rooms. And from that moment on, the mansion was never used again. Not by Aristotle, not by his daughter Christina, who visited once and left pale and shaken, refusing to ever return. Not by Jackie, who heard the stories and quietly made sure she was never asked to go. The house sat empty, locked, slowly surrendering to salt and storms, and the Onassis family, still wealthy, still powerful, never spoke of it again, because some places aren't meant to be remembered. Some houses hold too much weight, and this mansion, hidden on the edge of the Aegean, had become the one place where the Onassis legend finally felt human, where the wealth didn't matter, where the yachts and the glamour and the myth all crumbled away, leaving only what was real: loss, regret, and the kind of grief that turns stone into a tomb. This is the story of the mansion the world forgot, and the family that tried to forget it too. To understand why Aristotle Onassis built a mansion designed to hide rather than impress, you must first understand what it means to lose everything. Not metaphorically, not gradually, but in a single night of fire and blood, when the world you knew burns to ash and you escape with nothing but the clothes on your back and the trauma that will haunt you forever. Aristotle Onassis was born into wealth in Smyrna, a thriving port city where Greek, Turkish, and Armenian merchants built fortunes on tobacco, textiles, and trade. His father, Socrates, was a successful businessman. The family lived in a grand house. Young Ari attended the best schools, wore tailored suits, and expected a future of comfort and privilege. Then came September 1922. The Great Fire of Smyrna, a catastrophe that killed tens of thousands and erased an entire way of life. The Onassis family fled with refugees pouring toward the docks, watching their city burn behind them, losing relatives in the case. Volunteers. Boarding ships with no idea if they'd survive the crossing. They landed on the Greek coast as nothing. No home, no business, no money. Just the memory of what they'd been and the crushing realization that wealth, power, status, all of it could vanish in a single night. But while others collapsed under the weight of that trauma, Aristotle weaponized it. He learned the most important lesson of his life at 17 years old: never be powerless again. Within a year, he'd left Greece for Argentina with borrowed money and a single suitcase. He worked as a dishwasher, a telephone operator, a tobacco importer. He slept in boarding houses and saved every coin. But he wasn't just surviving, he was studying. He watched how the powerful moved, how they negotiated, how they turned connections into contracts and contracts into fortunes. He learned to charm, to manipulate, to recognize opportunity where others saw only obstacles. And by his mid-20s, he'd made his first fortune in cigarette trading. Not legally exactly, but in the gray zones where ambition meets opportunity and morality becomes negotiable. He used that money to buy his first ship, then another, then a fleet. By the 1950s, Aristotle Onassis controlled one of the largest independent tanker fleets in the world. He negotiated directly with governments. He moved oil across oceans. He played nations against each other for better contracts. He wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable, or so he believed. Because beneath the empire, beneath the charm and the power and the headlines about his affairs with opera singers and movie stars, Aristotle carried something he couldn't shake, the fear that it could all disappear again. That one mistake, one betrayal, one stroke of bad luck could reduce him to that 17-year-old boy fleeing Smyrna with nothing. And that fear shaped everything he built, including the mansion. The villa where his family had first found refuge after the fire had remained in the back of his mind for decades. A symbol of both survival and loss. A place where he'd been powerless, watching his father broken by circumstances beyond his control. When Ari finally had the resources to purchase the property outright in the early 1950s, he didn't announce it, didn't celebrate, didn't invite architects to create something worthy of his status. Instead, he did something strange. He ordered the house expanded in secret. Workers were hired in small groups, brought in from different regions so they never met each other, paid in cash with instructions not to discuss the project. Materials arrived at odd hours. Construction happened behind tall fences and concealed scaffolding. The result was a mansion that felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The exterior was deliberately understated. Mediterranean stone, cypress trees, nothing that would draw attention from the sea or the nearby coastal road. But inside, the structure revealed its true purpose. Walls thicker than necessary, reinforced foundations built to withstand far more than storms. Underground storage rooms designed like the watertight compartments of a ship. Ari's background in maritime engineering bleeding into residential architecture. There was a grand ballroom, yeah. Hand-carved staircases imported from Italy, marble floors that gleamed under chandeliers. But there were also the other rooms, a private wing accessible only through a hidden door behind a bookshelf. A study with no windows, walls lined with safes. A corridor staff called the quiet hallway. Windowless, soundproofed, leading to rooms no one was allowed to enter without Ari's explicit permission. And then there was the locked room, the one on the second floor that appeared on the original blueprints, but was sealed before construction was complete. No one knew what it contained. Some workers claimed it was empty, just 4 walls and a door that locked from the outside. Others whispered that Ari had placed something inside before it was sealed. Documents, perhaps, or something more personal. When asked about it, he would only say, "Some things are safer forgotten." The mansion became Ari's psychological refuge, not a place for parties or public display, but somewhere he could retreat when the weight of his empire became unbearable. He would arrive without notice, sometimes alone, sometimes with his son, Alexander, during the boy's childhood, teaching him to swim in the private cove, walking the grounds at dawn, pointing at the horizon and talking about ships and empires and the importance of never depending on anyone. But as Alexander grew older, the visits became less frequent. The boy who was supposed to inherit the mansion and everything it represented began to resent it. He saw it for what it was, not a refuge, but a prison, a monument to his father's paranoia, a place built not for joy but for control. Staff who worked during those years described an uncomfortable tension. Ari pacing the halls at night, speaking to himself in Greek. Alexander avoiding the house entirely, claiming it felt heavy. The two of them arguing in the study behind closed doors, their raised voices echoing through corridors that seemed designed to trap sound rather than release it. And then came the parties that weren't really parties. Occasionally, Ari would invite a small group to the mansion, never celebrities, never press, just business associates and old allies from his shipping empire. They would gather in the ballroom or the dining room, eating meals prepared by a private chef, drinking wine from airy cellars. But those who attended described a strange atmosphere, as if they'd been summoned not to celebrate, but to witness something. Ari holding court, telling stories about Smyrna, about the fire, about what it meant to lose everything and claw your way back. He wanted us to understand, one former associate said years later, that the mansion wasn't about wealth. It was about survival, about having a place where no one could ever take anything from him again. But survival, it turned out, was something even Aristotle Onassis couldn't engineer. Because by the late 1960s, cracks were forming. His marriage to Athena Livanos, arranged more for business than love, had long since crumbled. His affair with Maria Callas had ended in bitterness. His pursuit of Jackie Kennedy would bring him headlines, but not happiness. And his relationship with Alexander, the son who was supposed to carry forward everything the mansion represented, was fracturing beyond repair. Alexander wanted freedom, wanted to build his own life away from his father's shadow and the oppressive weight of the Onassis legacy. Ari wanted control, wanted his son to understand that the world was dangerous, that power was the only protection, that the mansion and everything it symbolized was a gift, not a burden. They fought constantly. Alexander called the house a mausoleum for a man who's still alive. Ari accused his son of being ungrateful, weak, unable to understand what it took to build an empire. And then, in January 1973, Alexander Onassis died in a plane crash. He was 24 years old. The official report called it pilot error. Mechanical failure, a tragic accident. But the circumstances were strange enough that conspiracy theories ignited immediately. The plane had been inspected days earlier. The weather was clear. Alexander was an experienced pilot. And yet, somehow, the small aircraft crashed moments after takeoff, killing him and leaving his father shattered. When the news reached Aristotle, he was on the Christina O. hosting guests. He collapsed, not dramatically, not with shouting or tears. He simply stopped moving, stood frozen on the deck, staring at nothing, as if his body had forgotten how to function. And then, without a word to anyone, he left Bern. Not for Scorpios, not for the yacht, not for any of the places where he'd built his public persona. He went to the mansion, the one place he'd built to protect himself from loss, and locked himself inside with the grief that would destroy him. When Aristotle Onassis arrived at the mansion in January 1973, he came alone. No bodyguards, no assistants, no family members trying to console him. Just a man who had built an empire on the belief that he could control everything, and the crushing realization that he'd been wrong. The staff on duty that day described his arrival as unsettling. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge them. Just walked through the entrance, climbed the stairs to the second floor, and disappeared into the private wing. They heard the door lock from the inside, and for 3 days no one saw him. Meals were left outside his door. They remained untouched. Water brought up in the morning sat there until evening, untouched. Concerned staff called his office in Athens, his yacht, his other properties, trying to reach someone, anyone who might know what to do. But Ari had made it clear before arriving, no one enters, no one calls, no one disturbs me. On the second night, the housekeeper heard sounds, not crying, Not the kind of grief she'd expected, but rage. Furniture being overturned, glass shattering. A voice, Ari's voice, shouting in Greek at someone who wasn't there. Words she couldn't make out, but the tone was unmistakable. A man arguing with ghosts, with fate, with a universe that had taken the one thing he couldn't replace. And then silence, mommy. By the fourth day, when Ari finally emerged, he looked like a different person. His hair, always meticulously groomed, was disheveled. His eyes were hollow, red-rimmed, staring at nothing. He'd aged a decade in 72 hours. He spoke only once to the housekeeper, his voice barely above a whisper. "Seal the room." She didn't understand. "Which room, Mr. Onassis?" He gestured vaguely toward the hallway behind him. "The one he was meant to have. Lock it. I don't want anyone going in there again." She nodded, though she didn't know which room he meant. There were several in the private wing, but later when she tried to ask for clarification, he'd already left, returned to Athens, to the machinery of his empire, to the public persona that required him to keep functioning even when everything inside had shattered. But something had broken in that mansion. Not physically. Not in any way that could be measured or repaired. Something atmospheric. Staff who'd worked there for years began requesting transfers. Some quit outright, refusing to explain why. One housekeeper, who'd been with the family for over a decade, simply said, "The house changed after that week. It felt occupied, not by people, by something heavier." Another staff member described hearing footsteps in the sealed wing, slow, deliberate, pacing, when she knew for certain no one was inside. A gardener reported seeing lights in the upper windows late at night, even though the electricity to that section had been cut months earlier. And the room Ari had ordered sealed? No one knew exactly which one it was, because when the staff went to follow his instructions, they found that 3 rooms in the private wing had been locked from the inside. Doors that could only be secured from within, now impossible to open without breaking them down. And Ari had made it clear, don't touch them. So they didn't. The rooms remained locked, and whatever was inside, furniture, belongings, memories, stayed frozen in place, untouched by time or human hands. But the mansion story didn't end with Aristotle's grief. Because Alexander's death did something worse than break his father. It cursed the family. Not in the supernatural sense, though many would later claim otherwise, but in the way that trauma compounds across generations, turning private pain into public tragedy. Within 2 years of Alexander's death, Ari was gone too. Officially, he died of complications from myasthenia gravis, a disease that had weakened him for years. But those close to him knew the truth. He'd stopped fighting, stopped touring. The man who'd once believed he could conquer the world had surrendered to the one enemy he couldn't defeat: loss. His daughter, Christina Onassis, inherited the empire and the burden. She was 24 when her father died, the same age Alexander had been when the plane went down. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Christina tried to visit the mansion once, a year after her father's funeral. She arrived on a gray morning, accompanied by her lawyer and a family advisor. They stayed less than 2 hours. When she emerged, she was pale, shaking, visibly shaken. She told her lawyer, "Sell it. I don't care what you get for it. Just get rid of it." But the sale never happened, because when potential buyers toured the property, they all backed out. Some cited structural concerns, the salt damage, the erosion, the cost of maintenance. Others were more honest. "There's something wrong with that house. I can't explain it, but I felt it the moment I walked in." One prospective buyer, a wealthy German industrialist, brought an architect to assess the property. The architect spent an hour inside and then refused to continue the tour. When pressed for a reason, he said simply, "The rooms don't make sense. The hallways lead places they shouldn't. In that locked wing, I heard something behind those doors. I don't know what." But I'm not staying to find out. The sale fell through, and the mansion remained in the family trust, locked and untouched, slowly surrendering to the elements. Christina never went back. She lived the rest of her short life bouncing between yachts, hotels, and rented estates, never settling anywhere for long, as if afraid that staying in one place too long would invite the same curse that had taken her brother and father. She died in 1908 at 37 under circumstances that remain disputed. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew her suspected something darker, a woman who'd been drowning slowly for years, finally too exhausted to keep swimming. And with her death, the Onassis bloodline, the dynasty Ari had built to last forever, ended. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who'd married into the family and carried the name even after Ari's death, never once set foot in the forgotten mansion. She'd heard the stories, knew about the locked rooms, the strange occurrences, the staff who refused to stay past sunset, and she'd made her position clear to the estate lawyers. I want nothing to do with that place. Leave it sealed. So it was. The mansion sat empty through the 1980s and 90s. No maintenance, no caretakers, just the occasional visit from lawyers verifying the property still existed for tax purposes. Storms battered the shutters. Salt corroded the balconies. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, finding purchase in cracks that widened with each passing winter. The grand ballroom chandelier, once glittering at private gatherings, crashed to the floor during a particularly violent gale, shattering into 1,000 pieces no one would ever sweep up. The garden, once meticulously maintained, became a wild tangle. Olive trees grew gnarled and twisted. Paths disappeared beneath weeds. The private cove where Ari had once taught Alexander to swim filled with debris and stagnant water. But the most disturbing part wasn't the decay, it was the preservation. Because while the exterior crumbled, the interior remained strangely intact, as if time moved differently inside those walls. The few people who managed to gain access over the years, insurance adjusters, local officials, urban explorers, all reported the same thing. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left decades earlier. Dust coated every surface, but nothing had been disturbed. A child's toy, Alexander's perhaps, rested on a windowsill in one of the upper rooms. A lace curtain, yellowed with age, still hung in a doorway, swaying slightly in drafts that came from nowhere. And the locked rooms? Still locked, still silent, still waiting. One urban explorer who broke into the mansion in 2003 posted photographs online. They showed the marble staircase, now stained and cracked. The ballroom, empty except for shattered glass. The dining room, table still set as if for a meal that would never be served. But the post that went viral was a single photograph of a hallway in the private wing. 3 doors, side by side, all locked. And on the center door, barely visible in the dim light, someone had scratched words into the wood. He's still here. No one knows who wrote it, or when, or what they meant. But the photograph spread across forums, ghost hunting websites, true crime communities. Theories multiplied. Alexander's ghost. Ari's unfinished business. A family curse that refused to die even after the bloodline ended. The truth, perhaps, is simpler and sadder. The mansion doesn't need ghosts, because it's already haunted by something far more devastating than the supernatural. The weight of a father's grief, the memory of a son who died too young, and the realization that no amount of wealth, no fortress of stone, no locked room or sealed wing could protect the people Aristotle Onassis loved most. The mansion was built to keep loss out, but loss found its way in anyway, and it never left. After Christina's death in 1988, the mansion entered a kind of legal purgatory. No heirs, no clear ownership, just a tangled web of trusts, distant relatives, and lawyers arguing over an estate no one actually wanted. The Onassis fortune was divided and redistributed. The Christina O yacht changed hands. Scorpio's Island was eventually sold to a Greek billionaire. The Fifth Avenue apartment became a private residence. The legacy was carved up, monetized, transformed into something manageable. But the mansion remained, because no one could agree on what to do with it. And more importantly, no one wanted to be the person responsible for it. Distant cousins who might have inherited a share wanted cash, not property. Lawyers advised liquidation, but the legal complexities dragged on for years. And every time a potential buyer expressed interest, they would visit the site, spend an hour inside, and quietly withdraw their offer. One real estate developer described the experience to a Greek newspaper in 1992. "I've renovated dozens of historic properties. I understand structural damage, salt corrosion, weather exposure, but this was different. The moment I stepped inside, I felt unwelcome, not by people, by the house itself, as if it was telling me to leave." My crew felt it too. Half of them refused to go past the entrance hall. The sale never happened, and so the mansion sat, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. Slowly, inevitably, nature began the work that human hands had abandoned. The Aegean is not gentle. Salt air corrodes metal, stone, wood, everything with relentless efficiency. Storms hammer the coastline with waves that sound like artillery fire. Winter winds tear at anything not anchored deep into bedrock. And the mansion, built to withstand loss but not time, began to surrender. The roof was the first casualty. Tiles loosened by decades of wind finally gave way during a particularly brutal storm in the mid-1990s. Rain poured through the gaps, staining the priceless mahogany ceilings, warping the imported wood floors, turning the grand ballroom into a monument to decay. The 75-foot windows, Ari's pride, designed to frame the sea, cracked one by one. Some shattered entirely, leaving gaping wounds that let the wind howl through the interior like something alive and hungry. The marble staircase, once polished to a mirror shine, became streaked with black mildew. The hand-carved banister, brought piece by piece from Italy, began to rot where water pooled in its crevices. The gardens transformed into wilderness. Olive trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches scraping against windows like fingers trying to get inside. The paths Ari once walked with Alexander disappeared beneath thorns and weeds. The private cove filled with debris, plastic bottles, driftwood, the detritus of a world that had moved on. But the most disturbing part of the decay wasn't what changed, it was what didn't. Because while the exterior crumbled and nature reclaimed the grounds, the interior remained frozen in a way that defied logic. Rooms that should have been destroyed by water damage sat untouched, furniture covered in dust but otherwise intact. Curtains that should have rotted still hung in doorways, swaying in drafts that came from nowhere. And the locked rooms in the private wing, still locked. Engineers who surveyed the property for insurance purposes in 1999 noted the inconsistency in their report. They described the advanced decay in the public spaces, the ballroom, dining hall, entrance, but expressed confusion about the private wing. Structurally, this section should have collapsed years ago. The foundation shows significant erosion. The walls have sustained water damage. Yet the doors remain sealed, and from external examination, the rooms appear preserved. We cannot explain this without further investigation, which our team was unable to complete due to access restrictions. The access restrictions weren't legal. The engineers simply refused to force open the doors. One team member later admitted, "We could have breached them. We had the tools. But when we approached, we all felt the same thing. This overwhelming sense that we shouldn't. That whatever was inside those rooms was meant to stay inside. Call it superstition. Call it instinct. But not one of us wanted to be the person who opened those doors. So they didn't. The rooms remained sealed, and the stories continued to multiply. By the early 2000s, the mansion had become an urban legend among locals. Fishermen told tourists about the cursed Onassis house, where lights appeared in windows despite no electricity. Teenagers dared each other to approach the property at night, though few made it past the gates. Those who did described the same experience, an overwhelming feeling of being watched, not by cameras or security, but by the house itself. One group of college students broke in during the summer of 2005. They posted a video online, grainy footage shot on an early digital camera before smartphones made urban exploration commonplace. The video showed the entrance hall, now lined with debris and water stains. The grand staircase, its marble cracked and streaked. The ballroom, where shattered chandelier crystals crunched under their feet like broken teeth. But the most watched part of the video came when they reached the private wing. The camera panned down a long corridor, 3 doors side by side, exactly as the 2003 photograph had shown. One of the students approached the center door, the one with the scratched words barely visible in the dim light. "He's still here." She reached for the handle, and the camera's audio captured something that made the video go viral. A sound from behind the door. Not wind, not settling wood, but something that sounded unmistakably like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving away from the door as if retreating deeper into the room. The students fled immediately. The video has been analyzed, debunked, and defended by paranormal enthusiasts for nearly 2 decades. Skeptics claim it was faked. Believers insist it's proof the mansion is haunted. It's haunted, but the truth perhaps lies somewhere in between. Because the mansion doesn't need ghosts to be haunted. It's haunted by memory, by the weight of everything that happened inside those walls. By a father's grief so profound it seemed to seep into the stone itself. By a family that tried to hide their pain behind locked doors and found that some things cannot be contained. By 2010, the legal disputes had finally been resolved. The property was officially declared part of a charitable trust, with instructions that it should either be restored or demolished. Neither happened. Restoration was deemed prohibitively expensive. The structural damage was too extensive. The location too remote. The cost-benefit analysis made no sense for a property with no historical designation and a reputation that scared away potential donors. Demolition, meanwhile, faced unexpected resistance. Local preservation groups argued it was part of Greek cultural heritage. Environmental agencies raised concerns about coastal erosion if the structure was removed. And then there were the more unusual objections. People who believed the house should remain standing, that destroying it would somehow release whatever it contained. So the mansion stayed, neither restored nor demolished, just existing in that liminal space between life and death, memory and forgetting, presence and absence. The local government erected a fence around the property in 2012, more to protect trespassers from structural hazards than to protect the house from trespassers. Warning signs were posted in Greek and English. Danger, unstable structure, no entry. But the fence didn't stop everyone. Urban explorers still found ways in. Photographers documented its decay for art projects and Instagram posts. Ghost hunters set up equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal. And occasionally someone would report the same thing, standing in the entrance hall, looking up at the staircase, and seeing just for a moment a figure at the top. An old man, they said, standing motionless, staring down at them. But when they blinked or raised their camera, the figure was gone. Just empty stares and shadows, and the sound of the sea battering the cliffs below. Because the mansion, in its slow death, had become something it was never meant to be. Not a refuge, not a fortress, not a symbol of power or survival, but a tomb, a monument to everything Aristotle Onassis tried to protect and everything he lost anyway. And as the years continued to pass, as the roof collapsed room by room and the walls slowly surrendered to salt and time, one truth remained. The house was dying, but it wasn't dying quietly. In 2018, a team of documentary filmmakers received permission to enter the mansion for what would be the first authorized filming in over 3 decades. They arrived on a gray morning in October, the same month Alexander had died 45 years earlier, with cameras, audio equipment, and a structural engineer to ensure the building wouldn't collapse on them. What they found inside became one of the most watched architectural documentaries of that year, not because of ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but because of what the decay revealed. The entrance hall was a cathedral of ruin. The marble floor, once polished to mirror brightness, was now covered in debris, fallen plaster, shattered tiles, fragments of the chandelier that had crashed years earlier. Water stains streaked the walls like tears frozen in stone. But it was still grand. Even in destruction, the scale was overwhelming. The ceilings soared, the archways framed views of the sea,